Hello, everyone, and welcome to the long-awaited continuation of Naroditsky's opening lab. It's been a couple of years since I've done one of these videos, but I've always planned to continue this series. Now, a lot of YouTube content is dedicated to gambits and trappy lines and ways to win quickly, but there isn't a lot of content on the other side of the coin. How do you actually play against these gambits? How do you refute the Stafford? How do you refute the Danish gambit? And that is where I come in. Opening videos for me are the toughest to make. They are the most ambitious undertaking. Here we go. I've decided to take the plunge. And the next video in this series is going to be dedicated to the Englund Gambit, which haunts 1d4 players now for many years. It is a very trappy opening. It's an opening that a ton of players don't know how to play against, and there's nothing more frustrating than knowing that you can get a huge advantage, but not knowing how, and ultimately falling into some sort of trap. But worry not, if you invest this hour or however long this video will take, I promise you that you will never have a problem against the Englund Gambit again as a 1d4 player. So without further ado, let me switch scenes and we will plunge in to our analysis. And one more note before I begin. You might remember this from the previous opening lab videos. These videos are meant for serious players who are willing to invest 45 minutes, an hour, maybe a little bit longer in order to master the way to play against these openings. I'm not really giving you any quick fixes. I'm not giving you any 4-move lines. I am going really, really deep into the weeds. I've tried to be as comprehensive and thorough as possible. In service of that, I've used the Lichess player database to actually look at what the most common moves are. And we will be going not only through the quote-unquote main line. You might be aware of the famous queen sacrifice in the Englund Gambit. That will be the main line, but I will also show you how to play against all of the other common responses, and there are quite a few. So buckle up. Feel free to pause the video at various points. You can set up the position on your own board. You can do some supplementary analysis. This is meant sort of as a comprehensive analysis, but obviously there's no way that I'm going to cover every single move and every single variation, but I will do my very best. So first of all, what is the Englund Gambit? Well, in the Englund, white plays d4 and black responds with the move e7, e5. Now, often this is just a pre-move mistake where you're expecting one e4, but this is a legitimate opening, and it has picked up in popularity, I think, over the last couple of years. There have been quite a few YouTube videos which have come out, and what makes this exciting for black players is that it is pretty trappy, and if white makes a series of natural moves, black can not only emerge out of the opening with a decent position, but there is one trap that tons of players fall into, and this trap does involve making a series of incredibly natural moves. What's hilarious is that we will deliberately fall into the trap because you have to fall into it in order to get a winning position. So the Englund is named after Fritz Englund, who was a Swedish chess player. He wasn't particularly strong. And what's funny is that Englund didn't actually play the Englund. What he did is sponsor a thematic tournament, I think around the 1920s, where players had to play d4, e5, and ultimately the opening came to be known as the Englund Gambit. But the first player, according to my research, who played d4, e5 was George Henry Mackenzie, Scottish-born, one of the strongest American players of the second half of the 19th century. He played e5 in 1870, and that move was not repeated in tournament play for another 30 years. Mackenzie ended up winning that game, so pretty impressive how some of those players in the 1800s were ahead of their time. So obviously, we accept the Englund. The first step is to take on e5, and before doing that, remember that you shouldn't pre-move on move 1. When you play d4, you definitely should not pre-move c4 or definitely not bishop f4, because e5 will come as a bit of a cold shower there. You should always expect your opponent to play c5 or e5, even in a bullet game. So after accepting the pawn, we reach sort of our first big crossroads. Black has essentially 3 or 4 very popular moves here. The main move by a country mile is knight to c6, developing the knight, to which, of course, we will respond knight f3. The line that's the subject of most YouTube videos is this move queen e7. This will be sort of our main line, and we will dedicate the most time to it. But before we get there, there are a couple of other important moves to consider. First and foremost, there is the move f6, and this move is nothing to sneeze at because if you just sort of blindly capture the pawn, which is fine, white is doing okay there, but black will recapture with the knight. And what you want to avoid in the Englund, and what I analyze with an eye toward avoiding, are positions in which you're giving black what they want, right? A big lead in development, potentially the f-file. It's very easy to stumble into a practically unpleasant position, right? You play knight c3, black can already get the bishop out and then quickly castle. And in a blitz game, this is not a very practical way to play. Therefore, you meet f6 with the move e2, e4. An important move to remember. Now, the idea is pretty obvious. You are indirectly defending the e5 pawn. I've loaded this move up with double question marks for obvious reasons. Queen h5 check simply ends the game in pretty standard fashion. King e7, queen e5 is going to be a quick checkmate. And if black plays g6, which is incredibly common, at least on Lichess, this position has occurred well over 1,000 times. The one thing to remember is that after knight f6, your queen isn't trapped. It isn't trapped because black isn't threatening bishop g7, and that gives you a tempo to bring your bishop out and pin the knight. And after queen takes e4 check, well, you can cover the check with bishop to e2. Black is a full rook down, and he's also getting massacred on the king side. Queen takes g2. The clinical move is actually bishop to h6, threatening a checkmate on f8. Black cannot save the bishop, and he simply loses everything. So f takes e5 is a huge mistake, and for that reason, the only logical move here is knight c6. Now we follow up with knight f3. And I love variations where you essentially sacrifice back the gambited pawn, but at the end of the day, you're the one who's having all the fun. When you're facing a gambit player, the last thing that they want is to recoup their investment, but to do so while getting into a miserable position where they're the ones getting attacked. And that's exactly what happens here. Now, knight takes e5, you simply take and play queen h5. That's virtually identical to the immediate f takes e5. Black has to recapture with the pawn. And now we bring our bishop out to c4. You can almost think of this as a fried liver, where white doesn't have a d pawn and black doesn't have an f pawn. Literally, if you added those two pawns to the board, it would be an Italian. But without the d pawn, white gets immediate control over key central squares. The diagonal is opened. Whereas without the f pawn, black is never going to be able to castle short. The king is going to be stuck in the center. And from a practical perspective, black is virtually lost here. So after knight f6, you do indeed play this fried liver style with knight g5. There's a cute line. If black plays queen e7, trying to take the sting out of the fork, then white wins the queen with bishop f7 check and then knight e6 check. Due to the pin on the d file, black has to give up a full queen. That ain't gonna cut it. So black can try to play this like a fried liver, right? We're essentially going down the main line. The chief difference is that after e takes d5, knight a5, the move that I really like here is actually bishop back to d3. Normally, in the fried liver, you give the check on b5, and that move also leads to an advantage. But bishop d3 is practically very, very strong. Now, knight takes d5 runs into the devastating queen h5 check, so black has to recapture with the queen, and now you simply castle. And it may appear that black is doing all right here, but in fact, his position is completely crumbling. There's no better way to see that than to follow the line where black tries to castle kingside as quickly as possible. After bishop e7, you bring your knight out to c3, attacking the queen. And if the queen drops back to d7, there is a beautiful tactical shot that leads immediately to a winning position. I'd recommend that you pause the video here and try to figure this out. This is actually a very, very instructive tactic, and I will be back in just a second. I got to turn the AC on because white's position is pretty much on fire. All right, hopefully that gave you time to think. So the move is bishop takes h7. And this is really a lovely tactical shot. It's quite easy to understand the idea. On knight takes h7, white delivers a check on h5 and a check on f7. And what's funny is that this has occurred once in 2009 in a correspondence game. And white plays knight takes h8 check. This is a classic windmill. Back to f7, then take e5. For some unknown reason, black continued playing. But we will pause our analysis of this line here. So if we go back to bishop takes h7, we remind you that white first castles, black develops the dark squared bishop, you bring the knight out, and then bishop takes h7 happens. If black takes the queen, this is the sort of second part. You have to have this intermediate move. Otherwise, you would have lost the bishop. Then, and only then, do you recapture the queen. And white is completely winning. Black's position is in shambles. We're up a pawn. Knight f7 is coming, and, the rest deserves a little commentary. So instead, the engine gives the only move, essentially, as bishop to g4. Black has to try to castle queenside, but this really doesn't help all that much. The queen is shifted to e1, where it aims both at the knight and at the pawn. And after black castles queenside, white brings the knight out to c3. So white's play is incredibly natural here. And simply put, the queen has nowhere to go. If it goes back to c6, then black walks into a fork. If it goes back to d7, I like throwing in the move h3 just for a little bit of luft. And after bishop h5, queen takes e5, the second reason you throw in the move h3 is that you have the f5 square for the queen, but queen e6 here leads to a winning endgame for white, where we're a pawn up, and we still have a huge initiative. This also actually happened. This was an obscure game between Glembeck and Barbalic, also 2009. Don't know what it was about that year that made correspondence players obsessed with the Englund, but that essentially covers the move f6 on move 2. So f6, that's the end of the line. After f6, we respond with e4, knight c6, knight f3, and all you really have to remember is this, right? You remember up to bishop c4, your next move's going to be knight g5. Just in order to get into that lost position, black has to make a bunch of engine moves. This is a miserable position. Last thing I'll say is that bishop e7 walks right into queen d5, right? This is where the absence of the d file really helps white, and there's no way to stop queen f7. This kind of trap does exist also in certain Italian lines. White wins the game here. So back we go to our second move, deviation. We looked at f6. Now let's look at the move that George Henry Mackenzie played, who of course was the first person to play this line. And this is a common move. It's the move d6. This might actually be, along with knight c6, knight f3, d6, which this will transpose into, objectively speaking, this might be one of black's better lines. The good news is that we don't really have to analyze d6 on move 2, because your response is going to be knight to f3. And in this position, black essentially has nothing better to do than to bring the knight out to c6. And this is going to transpose, which means it's going to reach the same exact position as we would get after first knight c6 and now d6. And just for the sake of organization, we will examine this line through the knight c6 move order. But before we get there, let's complete our examination of the move 2 alternatives. The only other alternative that is even remotely popular and makes any degree of sense is the immediate bishop development to c5. And the funny backstory behind this move is that it is featured in a series of YouTube videos. I think Eric Rosen gives this trap. I don't remember who was the originator of this opening trap. It's a hilarious one. And this trap happens if white plays knight f3, black responds with d6, and after e takes d6, black plays the move knight e7. Definitely go watch that video. I think there's something incredibly satisfying about watching people walk into these crazy opening traps. And hopefully you can understand the idea. After d7, there is bishop takes f2 check, and queen takes d1, and black picks up a full queen. What I will recommend is a move that completely circumvents that trap. Not that it's a dangerous trap. You don't have to take the knight on e7. But the move I prefer is actually knight to c3. And there is a specific reason that you develop this knight first and keep the other knight for the time being on g1. And you will understand this reason in just a moment. So if black plays knight c6, then once again, after knight f3, we will transpose into a position that we are going to examine through the other move order. So d6 is the only way to try to make this line work. And now white plays the move bishop f4. This is a very important idea in the Englund. Essentially, anytime black plays d6, your default is to bring the bishop out to f4. What is the purpose of this move? Well, it's quite simple. First of all, you're trying to provoke black into taking on e5. And if black does that, well, we don't even really need to analyze this position. You now have a pawn-up endgame where the king is going to be subject to an attack after white castles queenside. This is horrendous, so d5 is out of the question. But against any other move, such as knight e7, now you take on d6. And the point is that black cannot recapture with the queen. Black can recapture with the bishop, but ultimately black is going to be saddled with a tremendously weak and isolated d6 pawn. Needless to say, as a result, black's compensation will be exactly 0. So, for example, c takes d6, you play e3, then you bring the bishop out to d3, the knight to f3. not only does black have no compensation, but even if material were equal, white would still be better because this pawn is incredibly weak. And you don't have to worry about d5. You definitely don't have to worry about d4 because your pieces are all out of the gates. And obviously here, black is only going to lose the queen to bishop takes h7 check. And the same thing happens if black plays after bishop f4. We were looking at knight e7, e d6, bishop d6. This does not change anything. Again, you take on d6, and after c takes d6, you can play e3, just like we did in the other line, bishop d3 and knight f3. And white is almost winning, according to the engine, actually, with that extra center pawn. So the only other line here that I noticed is knight c6 in this position. Now, you can take on d6, but you can also keep the tension with knight f3. Remember that d takes c5 is never a problem because the queen trade is virtually always in white's favor. And after bishop g4, now is a good time to take on d6. Oh, sorry. C takes d6, and again, you know the drill. e3, bishop e2, develop your pieces naturally. I paused the line here. You're going to castle. Kingside, you're going to be a healthy pawn up, and black is going to have no compensation. So after bishop c5, the point of bringing this knight out first is that you want to meet d6 with bishop to f4. And the other bonus is that if black plays knight e7, you can actually go after the bishop with knight to a4. I like this type of move because it eliminates black's only active piece. Black is already in huge trouble here. There's no way that the bishop can worm its way out of the attack. Here you go c3, b4. You bring the knight out, and now you go c4, and black is in huge trouble because there's no good way to prevent c5. And d6, you always meet with e takes d6. This is water under the bridge. Clearly, this is not a particularly serious continuation for black. So now we go back one more time to the position after move 2. So far, we have looked at f6. We have looked at d6, which will transpose into knight c6, knight f3, d6, and we have examined bishop c5. Now let's get to the real meat of the matter, which happens after knight c6, knight f3. And first of all, we have to look at d6, which is a very serious alternative to what I would call the main line. The main line, of course, being queen e7. The recommendation in most YouTube videos, this move was brought into practice by a Latvian player named Karl Betinš. And Betinš was he was a great coffeehouse player, I think, of the early 1900s. He also developed the Latvian Gambit. Actually, that's why it's called the Latvian Gambit, in honor of Karl Betinš. So queen e7 is the move that you really have to know backwards and forwards, but we still have to look at d6 here. Now, your response is going to be, and bishop f4 is very much possible, but even more powerful is to bring the bishop to g5. And again, the idea is almost always the same. You are trying to get a scenario where after e takes d6, black is forced to recapture with a pawn. You don't want to recapture yet because this plays right into black's hands. Here you're giving black very active development, but if you throw in this move bishop g5 and black plays the obvious bishop e7, now after the trade, it's time to take on d6 because, again, black has to recapture with the pawn. And once again, we get the kind of position where black has zero compensation for the pawn. I like the engine recommendation here, which is c3 and e3, kind of playing this London system style, creating full control over the d4 square and immobilizing the d-pawn. Bishop's going to come out to d3 or e2, and queen b6 can be very comfortably met with queen to b3. And after bishop e6, you should not worry about the a file being open because you can just put your pawn on a3 where it is protected by its neighbor on b2. And the engine evaluation here is around +2, which I think is reasonable. You're going to bring your knight out, and you cannot ask for anything more than a pawn up endgame where black has no compensation. So rewinding back to the position after bishop g5, there are essentially two other moves that are more serious than bishop e7. There's the move f6, which I think is the most logical gambit-style move. And there is a surprisingly common move, queen to d7. And after queen d7, you now play e takes d6. You kind of violate the rule, but look at how awkwardly the queen is placed. The bishop cannot develop. The knight on g8 can't really be brought out because knight f6, you'll immediately snap that knight off the board and ruin black's pawn structure. So the most common move on lichess here is f6. I guess in response to f6, you can just drop your bishop back to h4. And this is not scary in the least. And if black brings the knight out to e7, there's a bunch of things you can do. I think the most practical, and I will analyze this a little bit more deeply and put this in the PGN file that you will find in the description. But I'm pretty sure that a simple move like e4 is going to give white a huge advantage. There isn't much to analyze here. You can bring the bishop out with check and drop the other bishop back to g3. Trading is good for the side that's up material. And in the event of bishop takes g3, h takes g3, once again, there's absolutely no compensation to speak of. So f6 here is not very serious. Queen f5 is a little bit more annoying and a little bit more concrete, but ultimately black doesn't achieve anything because he doesn't have the requisite pieces developed. You call black's bluff here with the move e4. And I probably analyzed this position for too long. The PGN file will have some of the other details, but suffice it to say, I don't want to bore you to death. So in response to queen g6, we play the move queen to d2. And here, I like the idea of castling queenside and basically just going after black's king. Bishop g4, you bring your own bishop out to b5. That's another nice bonus of playing queen d2. And after knight e7, there's a cute idea. You play knight h4, and you essentially force the queen onto an awkward square. If queen h5, then you will play h3 and g4 and win the queen. And after queen e6, you start expanding on the king side. h3. First, we grab the knight on c6 with the idea of knight takes c6, knight f5, putting the knight on a very powerful square, attacking g7. And here the simplest is to liquidate with knight takes d6 and castles short. So essentially, you don't have to memorize this because you can play this over the board and everything gives white a great position. But in response to queen f5, it's worth knowing the move e4. And if queen g6, we protect the dark squared bishop with queen to d2, preparing to castle queenside. If black plays queen to a5, the only thing to remember here is the move a3. You want to stop bishop b4 related shenanigans, and you're also preparing in some lines to trap black's queen with the move b4. For instance, if black plays bishop g4, again, you bring the bishop out to b5, and the idea isn't so much to take the knight on c6, it's actually to play the move b4 and trap black's queen. Queen b6, and now pause the video and see if you can find the simplest way to complete the queen trap. Well, the move, hopefully you were able to spot, is bishop back to e3. Always be aware of the power of retreating moves. The queen has nowhere to go, and black loses the game. So back we go to d6, bishop g5. So we've looked at bishop e7, not very serious, and now we've looked at queen d7, in response to which you take on d6 and simply develop your pieces. Lastly, we should look at f6. And here, of course, you do take the pawn and simply develop your knight to c3. I'm analyzing these lines for the sake of completeness, but realistically, black's compensation here is totally minimal because the knight on f3 is going to do a great job of blocking the f file. So even if black tries to quickly get his kingside pieces out, it's not going to be particularly effective. Here, I like e3, which is a slightly more modest move than e4. e4 was also very much possible. And here, I like the idea, once again, of castling queenside and turning things back around on black, actually going for black's king. So you play queen d2, and against almost anything, you castle queenside. And it's pretty easy to see here that black's queenside attack is no match for what white's going to do on the king side. I think a6 is natural. White responds with h3, forcing the bishop to make a decision. If bishop f3, you play gf, and you're just going to massacre black down the g file. And if the bishop drops back, then you play the natural g4, and the sort of classic kingside expansion with knight h4, snap the bishop off the board, and this is just a complete and total disaster. You can ignore black's pawn storm on the queen side because you always have the d5 square for your bishop. This is completely winning. Black's position collapses. So f6 may seem scary, and it may seem like a concession to open the f file, but with the bishop as actively placed as it is, and with the possibility of castling queenside, this is not scary in the least, and there's no compensation to be found. There is one cool little trick that I want to show you before we move on. If black plays bishop g4, then I really like the move queen to d3, and it's easy to miss the point of this move. After bishop e7, we actually take the knight on f6, and hopefully you're able to see where this is going. After bishop f6, queen e4 check picks up the bishop on g4. The Englund is full of these tricks, not just for black, but also for white, because black's king is always so weakened in the absence of the e5 pawn. And of course, g takes f6 is the only move, but it's all absolutely miserable after knight d5. We don't have to analyze any further. So back we go to knight f3. The good news is that f6 doesn't have to be analyzed because after e4, we transpose back into a line that we already looked at. Remember that we looked at it through the other move order, f6, e4, knight c6, knight f3, and hopefully you will recall that after f takes c5, bishop c4, this is like a terrible version of a fried liver. So f6 has no independent value, and that means, other than the main move, we need to look at one other line, and that is the move bishop to c5. And once again, when in doubt, you want to develop your pieces naturally. So when in doubt, the move is usually going to be knight to c3. But here specifically, black isn't even getting out of the gates, because if he goes d6, hopefully you will also remember that d6 is usually met with bishop to f4, posing black a terrible ultimatum. E takes d6 is coming, or black can choose a miserable endgame. And after knight g7, I really like this move knight e4. The point is to clamp down on the d6 square. Now black is unable even to get the light squared bishop out without losing another pawn. Furthermore, the bishop comes out to g5, and I had a little bit of fun analyzing this line. Knight f6 check actually wins the game. Right? This just shows you why you can't get away with this kind of opening play with black. Gf6, bishop f6, and white has the completely unstoppable threat of queen d2, queen h6, and queen g7 checkmate. And if, of course, black puts the knight on f5, then queen g5 is going to be the mating move. So after knight f6, g takes f6 is harakiri, but so is king h8, because now the queen is brought up to d3, threatening checkmate. And after knight g6, you have knight takes h7, and black loses loads of material here. Black will lose the exchange, and the game is simply over. So bishop c5 is a very common move, but if you go knight c3, black really, I would say, is borderline lost here, because either d6, bishop f4, which we've already looked at, or knight g7, don't forget this move, knight e4, clamping down on the d7 pawn. And finally, we have sort of cleared the shrubbery, and now we will look at the main move, which is queen e7. We're about 27 minutes in. I'm aiming for maybe a 50-minute video or so we're moving right along here. Hopefully the pace is not too overwhelming thus far. At the end, I'm going to do sort of a TLDR summary and help you understand what you really have to remember and what ideas you have to understand. So what makes queen e7 such a tricky move is that a lot of players, when they look at this position from the white side, they come up with two obvious candidate moves. The first is bishop f4 to protect the e5 pawn. And here they waltz into queen b4 check, forking the bishop and the king. Now, what's hilarious, and this is a side note, I don't want to get too derailed, but Jonathan Schrantz, who's a strong player, has a good YouTube channel. He analyzes a line where white goes knight c3, sacks the bishop and puts the knight on d5, and of course wins the rook. And apparently white is borderline winning here as well. But the theory here gets incredibly complicated. I definitely would point you to his video if you want to deepen your knowledge of this line, but I think the line I'm recommending is just a little bit more practical. The second thing that a lot of players do, and I myself was very tempted by this when I first started facing the Englund, that's the move knight c3, sacking the pawn back, and now knight d5. And to an untrained eye, it may seem like white is already winning, black is going to lose the knight on e5, but actually not. Black can take on f3 with check, calmly drop the queen back to d8. And yes, white is better here, but the evaluation is far less clear-cut than it may appear. White's development advantage is all well and good, but black's pawn structure here is pretty solid. And already, the knight is coming out, and white's knight on d5 is going to get smoked out. And I've lost some games here with white. White's advantage is not as large as you might think it is. It's only 0.6 or 0.7 here, according to the engine. And so, in order to truly refute queen e7, we need to go down the main line, and that is the move bishop to g5. And this, of course, walks right into the trap. It allows black, in fact, it encourages black to give the check on b4, and that is the only serious move. There's nothing else that black can do. Queen c5 has happened sometimes on Lee chess. Presumably, sometimes this is a mouse slip, and actually it is worth knowing a series of moves here. You do play knight c3, and in response to knight takes c5, you have this incredibly powerful retreat with the bishop to e3. Right? And this isn't just a computer move. The point of this move is quite straightforward. If black moves the queen, you trade on e5. Where is the bishop going? It's going to the beautiful center square on d4. And here, white's development advantage and control of the center is totally decisive. Black is just unable to get his pieces out of their initial squares. For instance, d6, I like the modest move bishop e2. And I analyze the sample line, knight f6, castles, bishop e7. It almost looks like a Sicilian where white is up like 1,000 tempi. But after black castles, white has this beautiful idea, b4, sacrificing the pawn, getting the rook into the game. And now what you do is chase the queen one more time and then bring the other rook up to f3. And just look at the extent of white's developing advantage. Black is totally and completely lost, and you essentially pre-move knight to d5. You play it even after bishop g4 because you take the knight with check, recapture the bishop, and you are completely and totally winning. Bishop takes f6 is coming next. So I really like this idea of knight e5, bishop e3. More common online is knight takes f3 check, but this merely allows you to get more pieces out and gain the diagonal for the light squared bishop. Queen b4, I really like a3. And if black grabs the pawn after knight b5, the game is simply over. You're attacking c7, and king d8, bishop d4 traps the queen. It's important to avoid the automatic knight a4. You might be familiar with this pattern, but here black has the evacuation route through e5. So you want to go knight b5 in this position with the double threat of bishop d4 and knight takes c7, queen e5. You chase the queen away with f4, and you win the rook in the corner. So queen c5 is not a scary move. Here, it's worth sacrificing back the pawn for an overwhelming development advantage. f6 is also played from time to time. I analyze this very deeply. I don't want to devote too much time to this right now. Suffice it to say that you play in the standard way. You take on f6, you play knight c3, and the only move that you should be aware of is queen b4, which may look a little bit scary, but really it's not. You take on f6, ruin black structure, and just play the move rook b1. Right? Don't be afraid to make these moves, which may not look the prettiest, but they do the job. Black doesn't have any pieces in the game, and so by defending b2, you are ensuring that your queen side is going to be stable, and now you know the drill. Throw in a3, play e3, and if given the opportunity, the light squared bishop is best developed to b5 with ideas like b4 on the horizon as well. And you can check out the PGN file for more analysis in the line with f6. But we really need to get down to business. Let's roll up our sleeves because queen b4 check is the move that you have to know the best. So white responds with knight to c3. Of course, one of the common traps that a lot of players fall into is that they panic, they play bishop d2, and they think, oh, let's smoke the queen out with bishop c3. Hopefully, you already know that black wins the game with bishop to b4. A devastating move, pinning the bishop to the king, and after the trade, white loses the game because knight takes c2 and queen takes a1 are both unstoppable threats. White's going to lose the rook and then some. But we avoid that with a 10-foot pull, and instead, we simply continue our development with knight to c3. And only after queen takes b2 do we bring the bishop back to d2. And of course, you could also start with bishop d2, but that move is actually a little bit less accurate because the queen could move back to e7. And you could play bishop c3 here, but it's unnecessary to allow any of this, especially because black is losing in this line. Black is objectively lost in the queen takes b2 variation. And the first step is to bring the bishop back to d2 in order to protect the knight on c3. Now, very importantly, if black plays knight b4, you meet this with knight to d4, and black just doesn't have enough meat on the bone here. After c5, you have the intermediate move rook b1, forcing the queen away. Now knight b5 is totally crushing, queen a5, a3. And oftentimes what you will see is that white's development advantage here is so overwhelming that the position, I hate this phrase, but the position really does play itself a lot of times. And of course, your main idea is to combine threats against the queen with the idea of forking the rook and the king on c7. This is really basic Betty. But first of all, don't be afraid of knight b4, and remember the move knight to d4. So obligatory for black is the move bishop to b4. And this is the lead up to the sort of Hambleton variation. I think we should name it after Rahman because he has played this line a lot with black. He has developed some of the theory, and it's definitely a dangerous practical weapon if white is not prepared. So white plays the move rook to b1. This is natural. You attack the queen, and here black reaches the most important crossroads of the variation. Queen to a3 is the move that most players play if they're not sort of familiar with the theory, and we will address this separately. After queen a3, knight d5, white reaches an absolutely overwhelming initiative in the center, and this is a line that you really don't even have to know all that well. As long as you understand the general schema of white's development, you will quickly see that black's position, to say that it is miserable is to say nothing. Black is totally lost in this variation. I did a lot of analysis here. I'm going to cover all the bases, but the line that you really want to know is queen takes c3. And after bishop c3, knight d2, black acquires 2 minor pieces for the queen, and it may seem like black also has a raging initiative. And after knight takes c5, there's the threat of knight c4. As it turns out, knight takes c5, I don't want to say it loses immediately, but it does lead by force to a completely lost position. So I guess it does. But it's very important after knight takes e5 to not procrastinate and to immediately chase the bishop out of c3 with rook b3. This is the first important idea of this line. Knight c4 doesn't work anymore. You take the bishop. The bishop is nowhere good to go. If it goes back to d4, you keep chasing it with e3. And now I like the pretty looking move queen to a1, pinning the knight to the g7 pawn. After f6, black's initiative has been completely repelled, and when you've reached that point where there are no longer any direct threats against your king, you can simply continue your development with bishop e2, then you will castle short, and a good move to throw in is a4, trying to drive this pawn up to a5. Here, black's compensation is totally limited, and after d6, f4, black is simply going to lose the g7 pawn. So bishop d4 is not serious. Much more common is bishop a5. And once again, our old friend, queen a1, arrives at the scene. Here, after knight c4, you simply take on g7, completely ignoring black's measly, play with the minor pieces. Black has nothing developed, and the move rook b5 ends all of the fun. The party's over because you're going to take the bishop no matter what black does. Knight f3 check, of course. You play king d1. And there is nothing left to analyze. You're going to take the rook in the corner and be completely winning. So this is all total BS. If black plays f6, then we play rook b5, again trying to get rid of this bishop, force it onto another diagonal. In the event of the trade, this is a completely winning position for black. I analyzed this further in the PGN, but not much to talk about here. Black's compensation is absolutely minimal. And after rook b5, if black plays knight c4, this is the only other important idea. We sack the exchange on a5, and you will see this idea happen several times. Don't be afraid to sacrifice an exchange for black's dark-squared bishop because this rids black of his only active piece. Queen c3 forks the knight and the pawn, and after knight c6, there is a devastating follow-up move that simply ends the game. Let's see if you can pause the video and spot it. Okay, well, the move is queen to g3. Especially when your opponent is not developed like this, you want to pay attention to all of the undefended pawns. That often leads you directly into the correct move. Queen g3 forks the pawns and wins the game. So what we've been analyzing is the move knight takes e5, to which we respond rook b3. We looked at bishop d4, and bishop a5 is met with queen to a1. And lastly, if black plays d6, we force the knight out of e5 with the move f4, and you know the drill. Once again, you play queen takes g7. Nothing has changed here. Knight d2, rook b5, or bishop d2, king d1, and black's position collapses. After king e7, I wouldn't even take the rook here. I would play the move e4, immediately addressing the knight on c4, and you can get to the rook later. You're going to take on c4 and threaten f7. And bishop g4 is not possible because you can take on g4. Technically, black can go like this, but when the smoke clears, white plays bishop c4, and black's position is totally in shambles. So knight takes e5 is the more popular move in the Lichess player database, but I wouldn't call it a mistake. The mistake is to play the first move e5, but after rook b3, black is simply losing. And I didn't really even find a single way to complicate the game. Needless to say, if black trades, well, this makes it even easier for white. And don't forget that the queen often belongs on the long diagonal in this line because you're going to be threatening f4, and if you can put it on c3, then you're also threatening c7. So this is not very serious, but let's get to the move that Aman plays, which is bishop takes e5. This is a far more serious line. Now let's take stock for a second. Black has 2 minor pieces and a pawn for the queen. And if you really want to deepen your understanding of this position, you can take a look at, you can plug this into ChessBase or the Lichess database and take a look at some of Aman's games in this line. If white plays this too passively, then what often tends to happen is that black gets the minor pieces out, knight f6 and d5, and ultimately black's position is incredibly solid. There are no weaknesses in black's position. The pawn structure is very much intact. And Aman actually played this in a classical game against a strong player, Steven Zerk, and I think he made a draw. I'm not sure how the game ended, but it's worth looking at the game. That will really put into perspective how important it is here for white to play aggressively. So the first step is to play the move e3, opening up the bishop. But the critical position comes after knight f6. This is where I've come up with a novelty that I think puts this line completely out of commission. Now, if you're looking at this for the first time, you might be playing bishop e2 or bishop d3. Is white better in those positions? Absolutely. But in order to really win the game quickly, you want to play the move g4. And maybe double exclam is overstating it a little bit, but I really want to emphasize how important this move is to remember because it takes this line, again, completely out of commission. The idea of g4 is twofold. Of course, you're preparing to fianchetto your bishop onto the most active square. But more importantly, you're also preparing to steamroll black on the king side with g5 and f4, and maybe even h4 and h5. For goodness sake, you're up a queen. Let's use that. And what better way to exploit that than in the context of an attack? So let's take a look at a couple of moves here. If black ignores with castles, you can play g5, but first I would bring the bishop out to g2 because g5 isn't going anywhere. And after d6, the lines here are very straightforward. g5, f4, building the pawn chain. And after bishop c3, you simply castle and pre-move knight e4. For instance, knight c5, knight e4. And once minor pieces start getting traded, I mean, black can essentially resign here. g6 might be forced because after rook e8, there is queen d3 with a fork on the bishop and the pawn. And after g6, you just play h4, you attack. Rook e8, queen d3, and h5. And black is busto here. He can't move the bishop because we've got the b file. h6 is coming and f5 to follow. This is plus a million, and there's not much left to analyze here. So rewinding, if black castles, you start with bishop g2. If black tries the more ambitious move d5, once again, you play g5. This leads nowhere. Knight e4 does nothing. You just take twice, and you're never afraid of this series of empty checks because the king has a perfectly serviceable square on g1. Queen h5 is the threat that will fork the bishop and the pawn. So after castles bishop g2, I really don't even see a move for black. h6 does prevent g5, but guess what? Obviously, you play h4, and this makes the threat of g5 even more powerful. So that's not an option. d6, I think, might be the only way for black to stave off defeat. I analyzed a couple of other moves in the PGN, but just in the interest of time, we're going to accelerate the process just a little bit because you do the same stuff in every line. Here you play g5. If knight d7, bishop g2, then f4, then you castle and knight e4. We've been there before. And if knight d5, you play the important prophylactic move, rook to b3, taking the sting out of the move knight to c3. If black plays it anyway, which he probably should because black doesn't have much else to do, black castles, then you can chase the knight with c4. And f4 is actually going to trap the bishop if the knight moves back to b6. Knight c3, you play queen c1. And after bishop e6, you have the very powerful f4. And simply at the end of the line, the dark squared bishop is trapped. And that is the sort of third idea of playing that initial g4 move. Not only is this pawn chain imposing in and of itself, but it also often traps the bishop on e5. Knight a2, you can play queen to b1, knight to c3, and now queen to a1 is very precise because the knight has no discoveries. And if knight b4, then just bishop d3 defending the pawn. And ultimately, black can procrastinate, but he will ultimately lose the dark squared bishop. Okay, so let's rewind back to the position after g4. The only other thing that I want to emphasize is the move d5, to which you again respond g5. And again, any trades of minor pieces is going to be good for white. Bishop g2 is going to come with great effect. Then you tuck your king away. Black is ultimately going to lose all of his pawns. b7, e4, those pawns are going to start falling, and queen e2, queen c4 here is a great maneuver. And so that move, the move g4, really does put this line out of commission. Just to reiterate, knight e5, you go rook b3. If bishop e5, you start with e3. Now, I looked at a couple of other moves here, although knight f6 is almost always played. d5, you strike at the center immediately with c4, and this only plays into white's hands. After d4, you can play knight f3, and obviously you jump at the opportunity to grab that dark squared bishop. You don't care about giving up an additional pawn. Moreover, you get the e-file here, so this is just a complete and total disaster. So that's not very serious. Knight g7 I also looked at, but really you have to remember is the move g4. And again, the PGN has even more extensive analysis. I also looked at the move h6, but you essentially get the same type of game in every line. White plays bishop g2, then f4, g5, and in every one of those cases, black is just totally lost. So the queen sacrifice, it's a cool line. Credit to Aman for really playing this in an OTB game. That was gutsy. But if you know the move g4 and you know the idea of rook b3 and queen a1, you are not going to have any problems winning the game there. And that leads us to our final variation, which is queen to a3. And on queen a3, we respond with the move knight to d5. This is actually an important thing to remember because a lot of players automatically play rook b3. It's a very tempting move, but the queen can drop back to a5. I know Levy had a video here where he won some games with the black pieces. If you play nonchalantly, you're going to give black a chance to bring the king side out and castle, and maybe you're even going to lose e5. White can still make this line work, but much more effective is the immediate knight to d5. Now, black has two options here. Most players are going to take on d2, but bishop a5 is a slightly trickier move that might be the lesser evil, although black is losing everywhere. So let's start with bishop a5. Here, you follow up with the move e4. And I think the most important thing to remember about this line where black plays queen a3 is that you don't need to do anything extraordinary with white. All you really have to do is bring your pieces out. You're in no hurry because black is unable to untangle in the center. Your center is so stable with the knight supported by the pawn that you can afford to complete your kingside development. And once you do that, then you can get down to the business of either trapping black's queen or, if black is able to castle kingside, going after black's king. So how does that actually unfold? Well, knight g7 is pretty standard. White responds with a very modest bishop e2. Now, you're never afraid of the knight trade on d5 because these pawns are going to tear black to shreds. After knight e7, it's a good time to play rook b3. And now, this is very instructive. Just castle. You just castle, right? Because black takes on d5, and this is all very, very one-sided. Everywhere you have some way to win either the queen or a minor piece. So you should trust in the power of your pieces here. But what I really like is after castles, white has the beautiful bishop c1. I love these types of retreating moves. The threat is obvious. You're preparing rook a3, and you're also removing the tension. So the queen has to move back to a4. And now look at what we do. We start chasing the queen. Boom, 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 boom. Every move with tempo. f5 is the only move. Now we take on passant, and we drop our knight into g5, threatening h7. How can black play without the queenside developed, right? This is a totally losing proposition for black to begin with. There are a lot of really cool lines. For example, g6, d6 is really pretty. Then a check on c4, and once the king moves, you pin the queen with bishop to b2. So all of this is tremendously one-sided. Knight g6, you also can play d6 with virtually the same idea. You can find more analysis here in the PGN. But suffice it to say that here, after bishop e2 castles, black's position is in total shambles. Oh, sorry. After castles, we were looking at the move. Let's see. So just to clarify, we were looking just now at the move knight takes d5. Yeah, we were considering the immediate knight d5, to which you respond rook b3, then you castle, and then you have this brilliant move, bishop to c1. So what happens if black does not take on d5? If black castles, well, when in doubt, just continue developing your pieces. And black just has no way to untangle here. A couple of sample lines. If knight g6, then again you play rook b3, queen c5, rook b5 drops. Actually, queen c5, bishop e3 loses the queen. So queen takes a2 is forced. And again, it's time for bishop c1. This time it's even more powerful because black will simply lose the queen. Queen a4, we play the calm bishop to d3, setting up the unstoppable threat of rook a3. Knight takes e5, trade, rook a3, And black will lose more than a minor piece because queen c6 gets forked with knight to e7. So as we rewind back to the position after castle short, rook b3 really is the main idea in this position, followed by bishop c1. If black tries to beat white to the punch, no problem, right? If black takes first and then plays knight g6, the simplest is again to play rook b3. And after queen takes a2, it's time for tactics. It's time for a typical idea that we've already seen once in a completely different line. But anytime you have a pawn on e5, a knight on d5, and a queen on d2, those are the ingredients of a lobster pincer mate that you can put into effect with knight f6 check. After king h8, knight g5, black gets crushed. There's a beautiful line where you sack another knight, but it's all very easy to follow. Rook h3 and queen h6 is simply checkmate. And if black plays g takes f6, then after e takes f6, queen h6, followed by knight g5, is completely and utterly unstoppable. The root cause of all of this is one and the same. It's always the same. It's the fact that black has no queenside development, and you cannot play a serious game of chess when half of your pieces are still on their initial squares. And so that means that bishop a5 might be the trickier move, but you respond in very straightforward fashion. e4, bishop b2 castles, and then rook b3 is going to happen inevitably with either a play against black's queen or a tactic on the king side. Again, more details in the PGN, and you are more than welcome to dig around here on your own. In fact, I would really recommend that if you want to deepen your understanding of this position, because you might be looking at this and saying, well, I kind of get that white is doing well, but it can be hard to understand the extent of white's advantage unless you're really, really well acquainted with how this position works. But hopefully you found that helpful. And finally, bishop takes d2 check is much more common. You recapture with the queen. And remember that queen takes a2 is completely water under the bridge. You could not care less about that move. You always meet it with rook d1, building the battery against the d7 pawn. And black runs into the same problem every time, which is that there is no good way to defend the c7 pawn. The only way to defend it, and the only move, is king to d8. A lot of people on Lee Chess play knight g7, just take the rook and win the game. After king d8, you might be tempted by the move queen g5 check. And it's actually less convincing than it appears because it helps black develop their pieces. Instead, much better is to play in, once again, the most modest possible fashion. You play e4, and again, just bishop e2. Develop your king side because black is totally and completely paralyzed. That's the beauty of this position. We already know that this is never scary. Here, it's even less scary because white drives the pawn down to d6, and then the check on g5 is going to be completely devastating. And if black tries to trade queens, you say, no, 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 c3. And once again, knight g6. Now it's time for a check on g5. Just castle king side, and it's just such a one-sided position. For instance, after c6, knight e7, queen g7 picks up all of the king side pawns, and knight g5 is coming in. One Lee Chess game continued h6. The queen drops back to g3. After knight d5, e d5, queen c3, let's see if you can find a really pretty move that ends the game on the spot. White found it in the game. Well, the move is knight to g5, opening up an attack on black's queen. But the pretty detail is that here we grab f7 and we take with the f-pawn protecting the knight, and we follow up with bishop h5 with devastating threats against black's king. Again, look at black's queen side. It still hasn't been developed. No matter what black tries, he's just never going to be able to push that d-pawn out to d6. Okay? So let's rewind for a second back to queen takes d2. Right? If black plays the immediate king d8, that doesn't change all that much. In fact, after e4, knight g7, it gives white the additional move bishop c4. This is an even more active move than bishop e2. And after queen c5, now we drop the bishop back to e2. Why did we lure the queen to c5? Well, you already know this concept. Now we bring the rook up to b5. And again, you reach a position, you don't know what to do. When in doubt, just castle kingside, and it's going to work itself out. Knight takes d5, you can take back with the rook. After a6, rook b3, we just pounce with knight g5 and e6, and this is a complete and utter massacre. Some of these lines are really, really fun. I had a great time analyzing this. Obviously, here you can drop the knight back and pick up the queen on a2. Essentially, the rule is you can do no wrong in this position, right? If you're making natural developing moves, they're most likely going to be some of the best moves that you can play. And ultimately, once you have brought your bishop out and castled kingside, then you should switch your attention to the kingside, and you should be looking at knight g5 and at queen g5 check, and you should always be keeping an eye on black's queen and making sure that there isn't a direct way to trap the queen. Okay, so what else did I look at? I also looked at rook b8, but you can acquaint yourself with this in the PGN. Here, you drop the knight back. And this is one of the only lines where white is okay with a queen trade. And the reason why is that you now have this massive clamp on the d6 square. White is actually completely winning here. g4 is a computer move, but I like the idea of bringing the rook into the game via g1 and g3. Black is totally busto knight e7. Again, you're always checking knight g5. And there's a kind of funny idea where you can take on h7 and bring the knight back, and only then you can play the move e6, or you could play it immediately. But if you want to be clinical, remember that rook f8 can usually be met with knight h7 and then knight back to g5. Okay, so just to recap, because I know that there's a lot of moving parts here, after knight d5, we looked at bishop a5, to which you respond d4, and now we looked at bishop takes d2 check, queen takes d2. The most common move on lichess is queen takes d2, so you are very likely to get this position. And if you get this position, then king d8 is virtually forced. After e4, as long as you remember that the key is to develop your king side and then either put the queen or the knight on g5, you are good to go. And again, there are more details in the PGN file. Queen a5, you always meet with c3. So you keep the queens on the board at all costs. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I think largely concludes the line with queen a3. So just to recap, let's go one more time from the beginning, and then I will kind of summarize the key points as a whole. But the main line continues knight c6, knight f3, queen e7, bishop g5, quote-unquote walking into the trap. Now we avoid bishop d2 and bishop c3. We instead play knight c3, bring our bishop back. Knight b4, you play knight to d4. And after bishop b4, we say bring it on, sack the queen. We looked at the queen sack. And after queen a3, you avoid the tempting rook b3. Instead, you centralize your knight immediately. If black plays bishop a5 and keeps the tension, we say bring it on, e4 and bishop e2. And although black is able to castle, rook b3 is going to come with absolutely devastating effect. We looked at knight g6, rook b3, and now remember the idea of retreating the bishop to c1. This literally will win you a couple of games if you hammer this idea home in your mind. Remember, queen a4, bishop to d3, no rush, setting up the queen trap. And we also looked at the more popular move, which is the immediate trade on d2, followed by either queen takes a2 or king d8. It doesn't change much. White's strategy is the same. You always play e4, then you can play bishop c4 if given the opportunity. If not, you can develop modestly to e2, then you castle, and then either knight g5 or queen g5 is going to be totally winning. If black plays h6 here, and for example plays, I don't know, b6, here already you're trapping the queen, right? So here it's like the third idea. You're always looking for this concept. But if black plays queen a5, yeah, you can't get your queen to g5, but the point is to get your queen to the king side in general. And in a position like this, again, when in doubt, I analyze these positions a lot with the engine. The engine always gives these sort of slow improving moves. Enjoy yourself here, right? Have fun. Look at this position. Black can't move a muscle. And the only other idea that you should keep in mind is that when the knight lands on g6, you can chase it away with h4 and h5. And if black plays h5 themselves, then you get the g5 square for either your queen or your knight. So let's not belabor the point here. Hopefully, I've explained this line fairly clearly, and that means it's time for us to summarize. We're right on an hour, so a little bit longer than I intended, but if you're still watching, you're still taking notes, thank you very much. I know these are very technical videos, but again, if you put in that time, you are going to be rewarded hundredfold because you're actually going to enjoy your experience of playing and aren't going to be stumbling in the same openings. So, the Englund Gambit, e5, we accept it. Black has two general ways to play. Black can play with one of the pawns, or black can play the main line with knight c6 and queen e7. If black plays f6, we do the fried liver thing and play e4, knight f3, and bishop c4. If black plays d6, then we play knight f3, and after knight c6, we transpose into the knight c6, knight f3, d6. Bishop c5, you avoid the Rosen trap by playing knight to c3. And remember, d6 is almost always met automatically with bishop f4, intending to take on d6 and ruin black's pawn structure. After knight c6, knight f3, d6, here you've got a bit of an exception. Bishop f4, by the way, is also totally possible here. But black has this tricky line where he goes like bishop g4 and then ed queen f6. That is why here I recommend bishop g5. And this puts black in a very unpleasant ultimatum. If bishop e7, you trade and take d6. If queen d7, again, trade and develop naturally. And if f6, trade and develop naturally. That is the commonality in all of these d6 variations. You accept the pawn and you bring your pieces out to active squares. e3, bishop c4. And remember, you don't have to castle kingside. Oftentimes, you can castle queenside and go after black's king with an h-pawn storm. So that brought us to, well, bishop c5 we also looked at. There you just play knight c3. This brings us to the main line. We play bishop g5, falling into the trap. Remember, queen c5, knight c3, knight e5, and now one retreating move, bishop e3. It seems like that's one of the sub-themes, is like retreating moves with the bishop. We have bishop e3, and then we've got bishop d2 to c1 in the main line. And if black plays queen b4, this is what you will get most of the time. The key thing to remember is queen a3, knight d5, and in the event of the queen trap, you've got two lines. If knight takes e5, we don't procrastinate. We get rid of the bishop. And remember, queen d1 to a1, followed by f4 and taking on g7. If f6, we play rook b5. And the secondary idea, we sack the rook for either the bishop or, in the event of bishop b6, we, of course, sack it for the knight. This wins on the spot. And that's about it with knight takes e5. Bishop takes e5 is the more serious move. And hopefully, I will be checking the chess.com database to see who discovered this novelty. I'm pretty sure g4 has been played a couple times on Lee Chess, but nonetheless, if you uncork this move and you play instantly, you'll feel like a boss. So the move g4 puts this line out of commission because it creates too many threats. You want to go g5 and f4. You want to develop your light squared bishop to g2, and you do it in that order. First, you typically bring your bishop to g2, then you go g5, unless, of course, black plays d6, then you go g5 immediately. Use your judgment. Knight d5, rook b3 here is pretty important. If black instead castles, then you have the time to develop the bishop first. h6 always met with h4, and ultimately you're going to go g5 and f4, drive down the pawn chain, castle, and position the knight on e4. Black's compensation is, well, at this point, there's just no compensation. Black can't move a single muscle. And finally, we looked at the move queen a3, to which you respond knight d5, bishop a5, e4. The two key ideas here: develop your kingside pieces. And then, I guess, three ideas: look for infiltrations with queen f4 and knight g5. Remember bishop c1, that retreating move. And always make sure that you're looking out of your peripheral vision at black's queen, because sometimes you can simply trap the queen, especially after you castle with rook a1 and rook h2 b1. And as I've been hinting at, there is a complete and comprehensive PGN in the description. It has some text annotation. So if you're feeling overwhelmed right now, worry not, because you can review the PGN at your leisure. And remember, the key is nobody remembers every single move in the opening. As long as you have a general understanding of the main ideas, and most importantly, why you play the moves, what is the zen of these ideas, then you are going to be essentially set for life. Hopefully, I've been relatively comprehensive. If I've left something out, I apologize for that, but you can always leave a note in the comments, and I will try to address any variations that I haven't gone through in this analysis promptly. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, it's been over an hour. Thank you so much for watching. You know, these videos are a labor of love. Hour-long videos don't do all that well on YouTube, but, you know, to those who are really in it for improvement, you know, this community is amazing, and I just love the feeling of helping people improve, tangibly doing something that I know will result in improvement. So thank you to everybody for the wholesomeness and the support, and these videos will continue. We'll talk about the Danish Gambit in the next opening lab video. And on that note, I will see you guys soon. Happy refuting the Englund.